The forest stretched endlessly before Olivia, its towering pines blotting out the sky like skeletal fingers reaching upward. The deeper she ventured, the more the world seemed to close in around her. The sunlight, which had once filtered through the trees in soft, golden beams, now struggled to pierce the dense canopy, leaving her in an eerie twilight. Every step she took felt wrong, as if the ground itself resented her presence. The air grew thick and damp, heavy with the scent of decaying pine needles and the faint metallic tang of something else. A rustle echoed from the shadows behind her, faint but unmistakable. Olivia froze, her heart hammering in her chest. She scanned the trees, but there was nothing, just an unsettling stillness that seemed to hold its breath alongside her. The silence that followed was worse than the sound. It pressed against her ears, her mind racing with possibilities. Maybe it was just an animal. Maybe it was the wind, stirring the branches. But deep down, Olivia knew it wasn't. The forest had grown too still, too unnatural. Even the wind seemed to shy away from this place. She felt eyes on her, though every time she turned, there was nothing but the endless rows of pines, standing like sentinels guarding some ancient secret. The trees creaked softly, the only sound in a world otherwise devoid of life. Yet, something was there. Watching. Waiting. The sensation was impossible to shake, like a cold hand running down her spine. As Olivia pushed forward, trying to ignore the growing dread, she spotted something up ahead, a shape half hidden in the shadows. It looked like an old weathered cabin, long abandoned, its roof sagging under years of neglect. The windows were dark, like hollow eyes staring out into the forest, and the door hung slightly ajar, inviting yet foreboding. Olivia's stomach twisted. She didn't remember this cabin from her childhood visits to the forest. It was as if it had appeared out of nowhere, waiting for her to find it. The air around the cabin was colder, a sharp contrast to the humid air she had just walked through. Her breath fogged in the sudden chill, and her steps faltered as she approached. A deep, primal instinct told her to turn back, to leave this place and never return. But something pulled her forward. Just as she reached the porch, the rustling sound returned, this time louder, closer. Olivia's head snapped around, eyes scanning the tree line. A shadow moved between the trunks, faster than she could track, disappearing as quickly as it appeared. Her pulse spiked, and a cold sweat broke out along the back of her neck. She took a step back, the wooden planks of the porch creaking ominously underfoot. The cabin loomed over her now, its presence suffocating, oppressive. The wind picked up again, but this time it carried with it a faint whisper, almost like a voice. It was too quiet to make out the words, but it sounded familiar. Her heart raced as the whisper grew louder, merging with the creak of the trees and the rustle of the leaves. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, circling her, drawing her in. And then, just as quickly as it had started, it stopped. Complete, unnerving silence. The sense of being watched intensified. Olivia could feel it, something lurking just beyond her sight, waiting for her to make a move. Her legs felt heavy, rooted to the spot, but she couldn't stay here. She had to go inside, to find out what was hiding within those walls, what was calling her back to this place. With trembling hands, she pushed the door open, the hinges groaning in protest. The interior of the cabin was even darker than the forest, the shadows pooling in every corner, thick and suffocating. She stepped inside, and as the door creaked shut behind her, she realized with a jolt of terror that the forest outside had gone completely silent. No wind. No rustling. Nothing. She was alone in the dark, with something lurking just beyond the edge of her vision, waiting for her to make the first move. Inside the cabin, the air was thick with the weight of forgotten memories. Dust coated every surface, and the faint smell of rot clung to the walls, as if time itself had decayed within these rooms. Olivia's eyes struggled to adjust to the gloom. Shadows danced unnaturally across the floor, shifting with every flicker of light that seeped through the cracked windows. It was as though the darkness here was alive, swirling and watching, waiting for her next move. She ran her hand along the rough wood of the walls, feeling the grain under her fingertips, when her fingers brushed against something familiar, yet out of place. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. Slowly, she turned her gaze to the object nestled on a dusty shelf in the corner. It was a small wooden toy, a horse, its paint chipped and faded with time. A jolt of recognition shot through her, and in that instant, the past rushed back with terrifying clarity. This toy had been hers, a gift from her grandmother, one she thought she had lost decades ago. But how was it here, in this abandoned cabin, far from her childhood home. Olivia's mind raced, trying to make sense of it, but no explanation came. Only dread. Her pulse quickened as she reached out to pick up the toy, her hand trembling. The moment her fingers touched its worn surface, a sharp, icy pain shot through her arm, causing her to gasp. She dropped the toy as if burned, watching it tumble to the floor in slow motion. The cabin seemed to respond, creaking loudly as though it was waking from a long slumber. The air around her grew colder, and a faint sound began to drift through the silence, a lullaby. Olivia's heart stopped. It was the same lullaby her grandmother used to sing to her, the one that had comforted her during sleepless nights as a child. But this time, it wasn't soothing. The melody was warped, distorted, like a distant echo from a place beyond time. The lullaby grew louder, seeping through the walls, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. Olivia's knees buckled as the room seemed to spin, and she collapsed against the wall, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She clutched her head, trying to shut out the sound, but it only grew more intense, more menacing. The room began to warp around her, the walls bending and stretching like something out of a nightmare. Her vision blurred as old memories, long buried and forgotten, forced their way to the surface. She remembered sitting in her grandmother's lap, listening to that same lullaby, but now something was different. Something was wrong. In her memory, she saw herself as a child, sitting by the window of her grandmother's old house, staring out into the dark forest. But there was someone standing among the trees. A figure, tall and shrouded in shadow, its face obscured. It didn't move, didn't speak. It just watched. Olivia's chest tightened with panic as the figure in her memory turned, ever so slowly, as if sensing her adult self watching from the present. Her blood ran cold as she realized that this figure, this presence, had been there all along. It wasn't just a fragment of her imagination. It had followed her, lurking on the edges of her mind, biding its time. And now, it had found her again. The toy horse lay forgotten on the floor, but Olivia couldn't tear her eyes away from the shadow in her memory. The figure had been watching her even as a child, and now, standing in this cabin, she felt its gaze once more, only this time, it wasn't just a memory. It was real. The creaking of the floorboards echoed through the room, and Olivia's breath hitched as she heard footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from somewhere deeper within the cabin. Each step seemed to reverberate in her chest, her heart pounding in rhythm with the sound. She forced herself to stand, her legs shaky, her mind spinning. Something from her past was calling to her, something she had long tried to forget. But the cabin wouldn't let her escape. It demanded that she remember, that she confront the truth of her childhood. The footsteps drew closer, though no figure appeared. Only the oppressive weight of the lullaby and the cold, creeping sense that the past wasn't just haunting her, it was hunting her. The cabin had become a prison. The walls seemed to pulse, breathing with a life of their own, trapping Olivia within their oppressive grasp. The footsteps had stopped, but the silence that followed was far worse. It was the kind of silence that pressed against her ears, making her heart pound louder, her breath ragged. She could feel the presence now, no longer hiding in the shadows but surrounding her, watching her every move. She was not alone. Something ancient and malevolent was in the cabin with her, and it wanted something from her, something only she could give. As she backed away from the creeping darkness, her foot struck something on the floor. She looked down and saw the wooden toy horse again, lying on its side, eerily out of place in the decaying room. A sharp pang of sorrow twisted in her chest, the memories of her childhood flooding back. Nights spent with her grandmother, her laughter, her warmth, and the comfort she brought. But now, those memories felt poisoned, tainted by the entity that had been watching all along, hiding in the shadows of her past. The toy seemed to glow faintly in the dim light, as if it were a beacon of the memories she had tried so hard to bury. And then the voice came, soft, barely more than a whisper, but unmistakably real. It echoed in her mind, filling the cabin with its dark resonance. "Give it to me," it said. The words crawled across her skin like ice, making her shiver. The entity was no longer content with simply watching. It was demanding something, and Olivia knew, deep in her bones, that it wasn't asking for her life. No, it wanted something far more valuable, her memories, the ones she had clung to, the last connection to her grandmother. The entity fed on more than just fear, it devoured the essence of who people were, stripping them of their past, leaving only hollow shells behind. Olivia's mind raced. If she gave in, if she let the entity take her memories, she would lose everything that had kept her grounded. Her grandmother, the love they had shared, the warmth of her childhood, it would all be erased, leaving nothing but emptiness. But if she refused, the entity would not stop. It would consume her mind, her sanity, until there was nothing left of her but a hollow, terrified shell. The cabin creaked ominously, as if the very structure was pushing her to make a choice. Her hand trembled as she reached for the toy horse. Could she really give up her memories? Could she let go of the only thing that had kept her tethered to sanity in this nightmare? Tears welled in her eyes as the weight of the decision bore down on her. The entity's presence pressed closer, its dark energy suffocating. It offered her no mercy, no second chances. This was the choice: sacrifice the memories of her grandmother and escape the cabin, or cling to them and face the inevitable descent into madness. The walls seemed to close in, the whispers growing louder, more insistent. "Give it to me," the voice demanded again, a sinister growl beneath the words. Olivia closed her eyes, her mind spinning. How could she choose? How could she let go of the only thing that had ever mattered to her? But the alternative was unthinkable. She would be lost forever in this cabin, her soul trapped like all those before her, wandering aimlessly through the pines. The pressure built, her breath coming in shallow gasps, as if the air itself had thickened, choking her. She could feel the entity's hunger, its need to devour her memories, to strip her of everything she was. And then, a flash of clarity. Olivia realized that the entity wasn't just after her memories, it wanted to take the very thing that made her human. The warmth, the love, the connection to her grandmother was what had kept her strong. If she gave that up, she would lose herself completely. But if she resisted, she might have a chance, a slim, desperate chance to outwit the entity. Her hand hovered over the toy, her fingers brushing its cold surface, and for a moment, she hesitated. The cabin seemed to breathe in anticipation, waiting for her decision. Olivia's mind raced, the weight of the choice crushing her. If she let go of the memories, she might survive, but she would be a hollow version of herself, forever haunted by what she had lost. But if she held on, the entity would never stop. She felt its malevolence closing in, tightening like a noose around her soul. She had to act. Now. With a deep breath, Olivia stood tall, her voice steady despite the terror swirling inside her. "No," she whispered, clutching the toy horse to her chest. She would not give in. She would not sacrifice the last piece of her humanity. If this entity wanted to destroy her, it would have to face her at full strength. The room seemed to tremble in response, as if the very walls disapproved of her defiance. The whispers rose into a cacophony of rage, the cabin groaning under the weight of the entity's fury. The choice had been made. There was no turning back now. The cabin seemed to react to Olivia's defiance, its very structure groaning as if the walls themselves disapproved of her choice. The air inside grew thick, oppressive, like a living thing, wrapping itself around her throat, making it hard to breathe. The temperature dropped sharply, and Olivia could see her breath in the frigid air, tiny clouds of warmth in a world growing colder by the second. The silence that followed her refusal was deafening, but it was the kind of silence that held danger, a silence filled with promises of what was to come. Then, without warning, the whispers began. At first, they were faint, soft murmurs that seemed to slip through the cracks in the floorboards, barely audible over the creaking of the cabin. But they grew louder, rising from every shadowed corner, filling the room with a low, eerie chorus of voices. It wasn't just one voice, it was many. Each whisper overlapped the next, creating an unintelligible, sinister hum. The voices didn't make sense, words garbled and twisted, like echoes of the long dead trying to communicate. Olivia's skin prickled with fear, a cold sweat breaking out along the back of her neck. She spun around, her eyes darting to every corner of the room, but no one was there. The cabin was empty, yet she could feel them, the whispers, the presence, just beyond the edge of her vision. The darkness in the corners of the room began to shift, moving in unnatural ways. It was subtle at first, like the flicker of shadows caused by candlelight, but there were no candles, no light. The shadows seemed to writhe, stretching and twisting, growing darker with each passing moment. Olivia's heart pounded in her chest, the sound of her own pulse roaring in her ears. The whispers grew louder, the words still incomprehensible but dripping with malevolence, each one a dagger of sound piercing her mind. The walls themselves seemed to shudder with the force of the whispers, and she could feel something else, a presence moving through the room, invisible but palpable, like a predator circling its prey. Her breath hitched as she caught sight of something out of the corner of her eye. A figure, barely there, more of a suggestion than a solid form, slipped through the shadows near the far wall. It was quick, almost too quick to register, but it was there. Something was with her, hiding in the darkness, watching. Olivia's stomach twisted with fear, her body frozen, her mind screaming for her to run, to escape. But where could she go? The cabin seemed alive, pulsing with the whispers, the shadows pressing in closer, the very air around her thickening with dread. She backed away slowly, her footfalls barely audible against the creaking floorboards, but the whispers grew louder, angrier, as if they could sense her fear. Then the voices became clear, a single word cutting through the cacophony: run. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a command, hissed from the depths of the darkness with a venom that made her skin crawl. The shadows pulsed in response, and Olivia felt a surge of cold air wash over her, like the breath of something ancient and hungry. The figure in the shadows reappeared, this time more distinct, a tall, impossibly thin silhouette, its movements jerky and unnatural. It seemed to glide rather than walk, its limbs too long, its presence too wrong. Olivia's legs buckled, but she forced herself to stand, her muscles screaming as adrenaline surged through her veins. She stumbled backward, her mind racing. The walls of the cabin seemed to shift and warp, the angles distorting as the whispers swelled to a deafening roar. The figure was closer now, still half hidden in the dark, its form flickering like a candle on the verge of going out. But Olivia could feel its eyes on her, burning, hateful eyes that seemed to pierce her very soul. The cabin no longer felt like a place of shelter. It was a trap, and she was the prey. The whispers began to change, growing softer, more seductive, as if trying to lull her into submission. "You cannot escape," they cooed, their tone shifting from anger to mockery. "You belong to us now." The floor beneath her feet creaked ominously, and she felt something brush against her ankle, something cold, slimy, and very much alive. She jumped back with a gasp, her heart racing, but there was nothing there. Nothing she could see. The shadows seemed to laugh at her fear, their whispers merging into a cacophony of taunts, telling her to run, telling her to stay, pulling her in every direction at once. She pressed her hands to her ears, trying to block out the sound, but it was no use. The whispers were inside her head now, twisting her thoughts, warping her perception of reality. The cabin felt smaller, the walls pressing in, the ceiling lowering as if it were closing in on her, trapping her in this nightmare. The figure in the shadows moved again, closer, its presence now undeniable. Olivia's pulse spiked as a sense of dread flooded her veins. She could feel it watching, waiting, feeding on her fear. The toy horse lay on the floor, a silent witness to her torment. She knew now that the cabin wasn't just haunted, it was alive, a living entity that thrived on the terror of those who wandered into its domain. And it had no intention of letting her go. The whispers reached a fever pitch, and the shadowy figure finally emerged from the darkness, fully formed. Its face, if it could be called a face, was a swirling mass of shadows and smoke, ever-changing, never settling on a shape Olivia could comprehend. It moved toward her, slowly, deliberately, the air around it freezing cold. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but her feet felt rooted to the spot. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe, as the figure reached out a long skeletal hand, its fingers curling toward her, ready to claim what it had come for. As the shadowy figure reached for Olivia, something inside her snapped. Her mind, already stretched to its limits, began to unravel. The air in the cabin grew so cold that frost formed on the windows, and the darkness around her seemed to pulse with malicious intent. Fear clawed at her insides, gripping her heart with icy fingers. Her breath came in shallow gasps, the taste of terror thick on her tongue. It was no longer just fear of the unknown, it was a primal, all-consuming dread that gnawed at her sanity. The figure loomed closer, its skeletal hand outstretched, and in that moment, Olivia's perception of reality began to fracture. The cabin around her twisted and warped, the walls bending and stretching as if they were alive. The shadows, which had seemed so still before, now writhed like serpents, crawling across the floor and up the walls. Olivia blinked, but the vision only grew more intense. The cabin was dissolving into a nightmarish landscape, one where the line between reality and hallucination no longer existed. The shadows whispered her name, their voices soft, almost gentle, as if they were trying to soothe her. But beneath their sweetness was a venomous undertone, a promise of despair. "Olivia," they called, their voices slithering into her mind. "You belong to us." Her legs felt weak, her body trembling uncontrollably as the shadows curled around her feet like tendrils, pulling her deeper into their embrace. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. Her throat was tight, the terror choking her, rendering her powerless. Every breath she took felt heavier, as though the very air was turning against her, crushing her under the weight of her fear. The figure in front of her, its form still shifting, still indecipherable, seemed to feed off her terror. The more afraid she became, the more solid it appeared, as though her fear was giving it strength, substance. Olivia's vision blurred, her thoughts spinning out of control. Her mind was playing tricks on her now, showing her things that couldn't possibly be real. In the flickering darkness, she saw her grandmother's face, twisted in agony, her eyes wide with terror as the shadows consumed her. Olivia's heart broke at the sight, but she knew it wasn't real. It couldn't be. Her grandmother was gone, long dead. But the image persisted, cruel and vivid, filling her with guilt and confusion. The shadows whispered in her ear, promising that she could end it all, that she could free her grandmother's soul if she just gave in. The figure stepped closer, its face, if it could even be called a face, swirling and shifting, an ever-changing mass of darkness. Olivia's mind began to fracture further, each terrifying vision blending into the next. She saw herself, lost in the forest, wandering aimlessly between the trees, her face pale and gaunt, as if she had been walking for days, months, years. She saw her reflection in the cabin's shattered window, but it wasn't her, it was something else, something twisted and broken, staring back at her with hollow eyes. Her thoughts became disjointed, fragmented, as the entity twisted her fears into visions that tormented her from every angle. Reality no longer felt solid. The cabin's floor seemed to tilt beneath her feet, sending her stumbling. Her legs were weak, trembling, and she felt as though she was sinking into the ground itself, the very earth beneath her turning to liquid, ready to swallow her whole. She wanted to scream, but her throat was raw, her voice trapped in her chest. Panic swirled inside her, intensifying with every second. Her mind was drowning in the chaos, her thoughts unraveling, and the figure, this living shadow, stood over her watching, waiting. And then came the whispers again, softer now, more insistent. "You know what we want, Olivia. You know how to make it stop." The words slithered into her mind, coaxing her, tempting her. The shadows seemed to caress her, their cold touch almost comforting in its cruelty. They promised relief from the terror, from the madness. All she had to do was let go. Let go of her memories, let go of her resistance. If she gave herself over to the darkness, the fear would end. She would no longer have to fight. The figure's hand reached out again, closer this time, and Olivia could feel the icy pull of the void it offered. It was tempting, so tempting, to let the fear wash over her, to stop fighting and let the shadows claim her. But something deep inside her refused to give in. A small, fragile spark of defiance flickered in the back of her mind. She couldn't let the fear win. She couldn't let the shadows take her. But the temptation was overwhelming. The longer she resisted, the stronger the shadows became, the more vivid the visions, the more twisted her reality. The figure was closer now, its presence suffocating, its hand inches from her face. The room around her pulsed with darkness, the shadows whispering promises of peace, of an end to the nightmare, if only she would let go. Olivia's heart pounded in her chest, her pulse loud in her ears, drowning out the whispers. She closed her eyes, trying to focus, trying to remember who she was, where she was, what was real. But the fear was like a tidal wave, crashing over her, threatening to pull her under. She could feel the darkness creeping into her mind, wrapping around her thoughts like a vice. The figure leaned closer, and Olivia could feel its breath, cold and rank, on her skin. The temptation to surrender was almost unbearable. It would be so easy, so blissfully easy to stop fighting. But in that moment, a single memory broke through the fog of fear. The sound of her grandmother's voice, soft and kind, singing the lullaby that had once comforted her as a child. The warmth of those memories surged through her, cutting through the cold darkness like a blade of light. Olivia held onto that memory with everything she had, refusing to let go. She opened her eyes, her gaze locking onto the figure before her. "No," she whispered, her voice trembling but firm. "You can't have me." The figure recoiled, the shadows around it writhing in fury. The whispers turned to screams, a cacophony of rage and despair as the entity realized it was losing its hold. Olivia's fear still gripped her, but she was no longer its prisoner. The temptation of surrender faded, replaced by a fierce determination. She would not let the shadows take her. Not now. Not ever. The cabin seemed to writhe in response to Olivia's defiance, the very walls quivering as if alive, as if the structure itself was furious with her refusal to surrender. The shadows, once merely shifting at the edges of her vision, now erupted in violent spasms, twisting and contorting into grotesque shapes. The air grew thick with the smell of decay, as though the rot of the past had seeped into the very bones of the place. Olivia's heart raced, her pulse thundering in her ears, but she clung desperately to the memory of her grandmother, her last defense against the all-consuming darkness. The figure before her, once shrouded in shadow, began to take a more solid form. Its shape twisted and distorted, a grotesque mockery of humanity. Long bony limbs stretched from its body, its skin like pale parchment pulled too tightly over sharp, angular bones. Its face, or what passed for a face, was a nightmarish amalgamation of shifting features, flickering between countless expressions of pain, rage, and sorrow. Hollow eyes, black as voids, stared at Olivia with an intensity that made her feel as if her very soul was being laid bare. This was no longer just a presence. It was a force of pure malevolence, an ancient entity born of fear itself. Olivia's legs trembled beneath her, but she refused to move, her eyes locked on the entity. She could feel its hunger, its need to consume her memories, her fear, her very essence. The whispers had turned to a low guttural growl, reverberating through the room like the rumble of an earthquake. The walls groaned, the floor beneath her feet cracking as if the entire cabin was about to collapse. But the entity didn't attack. It waited. It wanted something more from her, something far deeper than fear. It wanted her to break. A chilling realization crept into Olivia's mind. The entity wasn't just here to scare her. It was here because it was connected to her past, to her very bloodline. This place, this dark, forgotten cabin, had once been a refuge for her ancestors, a place where secrets had been buried long ago. And now those secrets were coming to the surface. The entity had been waiting for her return, waiting for her to unlock the door that had been sealed in her family's history. The truth was hidden in the darkness, and only Olivia had the key. The whispers slithered through her mind again, but now they spoke in familiar tones, her grandmother's voice, twisted and warped, begging her to give in. "You have to see," the voice urged, echoing through the shadows. "You have to remember." Olivia's stomach churned, bile rising in her throat as flashes of forgotten memories surged to the forefront of her mind. She saw herself as a child, playing in the forest, laughing under the watchful eyes of her grandmother. But something else was there, lurking in the background, something she had always felt but never truly seen. The entity moved closer, its bony fingers curling in the air as if pulling those memories out of her, twisting them into something unrecognizable. Olivia clutched her head, fighting the surge of images that flooded her mind. She saw her grandmother, standing at the edge of the forest, her face pale with fear, her hand shaking as she whispered to the trees. There had been rituals, things her family had kept secret for generations, things Olivia had never known. But now, the truth was revealing itself, and it was far more terrifying than anything she could have imagined. The entity was not just a monster, it was a part of her family's legacy, a curse that had been passed down through the bloodline, bound to this place. Her ancestors had made a pact with the darkness, seeking power, protection, or something far worse. And now, Olivia was the final link in that chain. The entity needed her to complete its hold on the mortal world, to finally break free from the shadows and take physical form. The full weight of her family's sins pressed down on her, and Olivia's breath caught in her throat. She was not just fighting for her life, she was fighting for her very soul. The cabin trembled as the entity's presence grew stronger, feeding off the dark memories that were now flooding Olivia's mind. The walls began to bleed, thick rivulets of black tar oozing from the cracks, pooling at her feet. The shadows swirled around her, their whispers now a maddening cacophony, urging her to submit, to give in to the legacy that had been laid out before her. But Olivia refused. She couldn't let this thing win. She couldn't let it use her to escape into the world. Her fingers curled tightly around the small wooden toy horse, the only tangible link she had left to the innocence of her childhood. It was her anchor, the one thing keeping her grounded in the face of the overwhelming darkness. The entity recoiled slightly, its form flickering as it sensed her resistance. Olivia could feel it weakening, if only for a moment. This was her chance, her only chance to break free of the curse, to sever the bond her family had created with the darkness. Summoning every ounce of strength she had left, Olivia stepped forward, her eyes blazing with defiance. "You won't take me," she hissed through clenched teeth. "I'm not part of this." The entity's face twisted into a mask of rage, its skeletal hands stretching toward her, claws extended. The room shook violently, the walls cracking as if the entire cabin was going to collapse in on itself. The darkness surged toward her, but Olivia stood her ground, clutching the toy horse tightly, the memory of her grandmother's love burning in her heart. In that moment, Olivia understood the truth. The entity had no real power over her unless she gave it that power. It fed on fear, on guilt, on the darkness within her. But she wasn't just the product of her family's mistakes. She had a choice. And she chose to fight. With a cry of defiance, she threw the toy horse into the center of the room, where it shattered against the floor. The entity let out a howl of fury, the shadows recoiling as if burned by an invisible light. The cabin trembled, the walls buckling under the force of the entity's rage. But Olivia stood firm. She had made her choice. The entity's connection to her family, was broken. The darkness shrieked, the shadows convulsing as the cabin around her began to collapse. Olivia's heart pounded in her chest, but she knew she had won. The entity's form flickered and faded, its hold on the mortal world slipping away. And as the last of the shadows receded, the cabin fell silent once more, the oppressive darkness lifting like a heavy fog. Olivia stood in the center of the ruined cabin, her breath ragged, her body trembling. The moment of truth had come, and she had survived. But as she turned to leave, a single whisper lingered in the air, soft and venomous. This isn't over. The cabin was collapsing around her, the walls groaning as the structure threatened to cave in. Dust swirled in the dim light, and cracks snaked along the floor like jagged scars. Yet Olivia stood motionless, her heart still pounding from the confrontation with the entity. The air had grown impossibly heavy, thick with the scent of decay, mold, and something far more ancient, like the breath of death itself. She could feel the presence retreating, but it wasn't gone. No, the entity was still here, lurking just beyond the edges of the crumbling cabin, watching, waiting for her next move. This was not over, not yet. The whispers had faded, but the silence that followed was worse. It was an oppressive, unnatural stillness that made every hair on her body stand on end. Olivia's body trembled with exhaustion, her mind a blur of fear and confusion, but she knew this wasn't the end. The entity had been weakened, but it wasn't defeated. The final confrontation was coming. She could feel it in her bones, in the way the shadows around her seemed to tighten, suffocating the very air she breathed. This was no longer just a fight for survival. It was a battle for her soul. Suddenly, the cabin's door slammed shut with a deafening bang, and the temperature in the room plummeted. Frost spread across the walls, the windows fogging over as the cold seeped in from every corner. Olivia's breath came out in ragged gasps, her chest tight with dread. The darkness outside the cabin thickened, coalescing into something solid, something alive. The figure was back, no longer a mere shadow, but a towering, grotesque creature that seemed to defy reality itself. Its form shifted and warped, limbs stretching unnaturally, its face a twisted amalgamation of features, none of which made sense. It was as though the entity couldn't settle on a single form, as if it was a reflection of every nightmare Olivia had ever had. The creature's eyes, if they could be called eyes, were hollow, black voids that seemed to pull at her, drawing her closer. It moved toward her slowly, deliberately, each step echoing through the shattered remains of the cabin like a death knell. Olivia's body screamed at her to run, but there was nowhere to go. The cabin had become a prison, and the entity was its warden. Her heart raced, her hands trembling as she backed away from the advancing horror, her mind scrambling for any kind of plan, any way to escape. But the walls were closing in, the darkness pressing down on her like a weight she couldn't bear. The entity stopped just a few feet from her, its form towering over her, casting a shadow that seemed to swallow the entire room. The air around it crackled with dark energy, and Olivia could feel it, the pull of the void, the promise of oblivion. The creature didn't speak, but its intent was clear. It wanted to consume her, to take what little light remained within her and drag her into the abyss. The whispers returned, faint but insistent, echoing in her mind, telling her to give up, to surrender. "You can't win," they said, each word dripping with malice. "You're alone. There's no escape." But Olivia refused to believe that. She had come too far, fought too hard to let this thing take her now. Her mind raced, searching for a weapon, for anything she could use to fight back. And then she remembered, the toy horse. It had shattered on the floor, but the pieces were still there, scattered across the room. It had been the last link to her grandmother, the only thing grounding her in reality. And now, it was her only hope. She had broken the entity's connection to her with that toy once before. Maybe, just maybe, it could help her again. Without thinking, Olivia dropped to the floor, her fingers scrambling to find the shards of the broken toy. The entity hissed, its form rippling with rage, but it didn't move. It was waiting, watching, its dark presence filling the room. Her fingers closed around one of the larger pieces, a jagged fragment of wood, cold to the touch, but solid. The whispers in her head grew louder, the pressure building as the entity sensed her defiance. "You cannot stop me," it growled, its voice a deep guttural snarl that seemed to vibrate through the very air. But Olivia didn't stop. She stood, holding the fragment of the toy horse in her hand like a talisman, her breath coming in short, desperate gasps. The entity towered over her, its face, or what passed for a face, twisting into a grotesque grin, as if amused by her futile resistance. "You think that can save you?" it sneered, the voice scraping across her mind like nails on a chalkboard. "You are nothing. You are mine." Olivia's heart pounded in her chest, but she held the fragment tighter, her knuckles white with the force of her grip. "No," she whispered, her voice trembling but resolute. "I'm not yours. I never was." With a surge of adrenaline, she lunged forward, driving the shard of the toy into the creature's form. For a split second, nothing happened. The entity stood still, the room silent, as if time itself had frozen. And then the scream. It wasn't a sound of pain or rage, it was something far worse. It was the sound of reality unraveling, a piercing wail that seemed to come from every corner of the room, from the very fabric of existence. The entity convulsed, its form flickering wildly, as if it were being torn apart by invisible forces. The shadows around it writhed, retreating as the light began to return to the cabin. The air shimmered, and for the first time, Olivia saw it, the truth behind the creature. It wasn't just a monster. It was a manifestation of every fear, every sin, every dark thought that had ever plagued her family. It was the embodiment of the curse that had haunted her bloodline for generations. The entity roared, its form dissolving into smoke, its power unraveling before her eyes. But even as it disintegrated, it reached for her, its hollow eyes burning with hatred. "This is not over," it hissed, its voice barely more than a whisper now. "I will return. I will always return." Olivia staggered back as the creature vanished, the last remnants of its presence disappearing into the shadows. The cabin was silent once more, the oppressive weight of the darkness lifted. But the words lingered in the air, a promise of future terror. She had won, for now. But the entity's final threat echoed in her mind, a reminder that the darkness was never truly gone. It was always waiting, just beyond the edge of the light, watching, biding its time. With trembling hands, Olivia turned and walked out of the cabin, the cold night air hitting her like a slap. The forest was quiet, too quiet, and as she looked back at the cabin one last time, she knew the truth. The entity would return. It always did. But she had survived this night, and as she walked into the shadows of the pines, she carried with her the knowledge that she could fight it again. The final battle had been won, but the war was far from over. As Olivia stepped out of the cabin, the cold night air wrapped around her like an unforgiving embrace. The silence of the forest was unnerving, almost as if the trees themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something. She glanced back at the cabin, now nothing more than a dark silhouette against the endless stretch of pines. The oppressive presence that had threatened to consume her was gone, but its absence left an unsettling void, one that Olivia couldn't quite shake. The cabin stood there, silent and foreboding, as if it had swallowed all the horrors within, only to hide them again, waiting for another victim. Olivia took a deep breath, her lungs burning with the cold, her body still trembling from the confrontation. She had won, or at least she thought she had. The entity was gone, defeated, its dark, twisted form reduced to smoke and shadows. But something still felt wrong. The entity's final words echoed in her mind, a chilling promise: "I will return. I will always return." The more she replayed those words in her head, the more a dreadful realization began to sink in. Had she truly won, or had she only bought herself time? As she stepped deeper into the forest, the trees seemed to close in around her, their tall, dark forms looming like silent sentinels. The ground beneath her feet felt strange, almost as if it were shifting subtly, alive in a way she couldn't fully explain. The pines whispered in the wind, their branches creaking softly, but there was something beneath that sound, something she couldn't quite hear but could feel, just on the edge of her senses. It was as though the forest itself had absorbed the entity, its malevolence now spread throughout the trees, watching her with unseen eyes. She glanced over her shoulder, half expecting to see movement in the shadows, but there was nothing. Just the quiet, suffocating darkness that blanketed the forest. The whispers that had once filled the cabin were gone, but the silence that replaced them felt even more threatening. Olivia's heart pounded in her chest, her instinct screaming that she wasn't truly safe, that the entity was still with her, lurking somewhere just out of sight. The cabin had been the focal point of its power, but now it was everywhere, in the wind, in the trees, in the ground beneath her feet. A sudden noise startled her, a faint rustling from somewhere deep in the woods. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. The sound was subtle, barely noticeable, but unmistakable. Something was moving in the forest. Her eyes darted toward the direction of the noise, but all she could see was darkness. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, but the movement didn't seem natural. It was too deliberate, too controlled. The rustling came again, closer this time, and Olivia felt her pulse quicken, her hands clenching into fists. Every part of her body was telling her to run, but she couldn't move, her legs rooted to the spot as if the forest itself was holding her in place. The memories of the cabin, the entity, the confrontation, all of it flooded her mind in a chaotic rush. The rustling grew louder, closer, and Olivia's breath came in short, panicked gasps. She spun around, her eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of movement, but the forest remained still, too still. It was as if the very air had turned against her, thick and suffocating. And then she saw it, a shadow, just at the edge of her vision, moving between the trees. It was fleeting, barely more than a flicker of darkness, but it was there. Her heart pounded in her ears as she strained to see, but the shadow disappeared as quickly as it had appeared. The forest fell silent again, but Olivia knew better. The entity hadn't been destroyed. It had only changed, spread out like a dark infection, inhabiting the very fabric of the forest. A deep sense of dread settled in her chest as she realized that the entity hadn't been bound to the cabin. It was free now, dispersed through the forest, watching, waiting, biding its time. Olivia's victory had been hollow, a temporary reprieve in a battle that was far from over. She was no longer dealing with a single malevolent force confined to a cabin. It had become part of the land itself. And now, it would follow her wherever she went. The cold wind picked up, brushing past her skin like a warning. The trees groaned under its weight, their branches stretching out like fingers, grasping at the night sky. Olivia felt the weight of the forest pressing in on her, an oppressive presence that made it hard to breathe. The darkness felt alive, swirling around her, watching her with unseen eyes. She had survived the night, but the forest had changed. It wasn't the same place she had known as a child. It was infected, corrupted by the entity that had tried to claim her. She started walking again, her footsteps crunching against the dead leaves on the ground, but the feeling of being watched never left her. Every shadow felt too deep, every whisper of the wind too close. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of what had happened. The cabin, her grandmother, the entity, it was all connected, woven into a dark, incomprehensible web of horror. But there were no answers. Only the unsettling knowledge that the terror was far from over. As Olivia moved deeper into the forest, a new sound reached her ears. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable, the soft hum of a lullaby. Her heart stopped. It was the same melody her grandmother had sung to her as a child, the same one that had echoed through the cabin. But her grandmother was long gone, and there was no one else here. The song seemed to float on the wind, carried through the trees, wrapping around her like a sinister embrace. Terror gripped her heart as she realized the truth. The entity was still with her. It had left a mark on her, a connection that couldn't be broken so easily. The lullaby was its way of reminding her that it wasn't finished, that it would always be there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for her to let her guard down. The forest may have seemed quiet now, but the entity was patient. It would wait. It would follow her. And one day, when she least expected it, it would return. Olivia quickened her pace, her breath coming in short, panicked bursts. The lullaby followed her, growing louder with every step. The shadows seemed to move with her, creeping closer, their tendrils wrapping around her ankles, pulling her back toward the cabin, toward the darkness. She fought against the fear, against the overwhelming sense that she would never truly be free. But deep down, she knew the truth. The forest had claimed her, just as it had claimed so many before her. As she disappeared into the shadows of the pines, the lullaby faded, leaving only the sound of the wind and the creak of the trees. The cabin stood silent once more, a dark, forgotten relic of the past. But the entity remained. It always did, waiting for the next soul to wander too far into the forest, to step into the cabin and awaken the darkness that slept within. The mystery remained, unsolved, unanswered, a chilling reminder that some evils can never be truly defeated. And somewhere in the depths of the forest, the entity waited, its hollow eyes fixed on the darkness ahead. It was only a matter of time.